know where we are in the
Yes, we are going to start. I've been on a pattern of beginning the class, continuing from where we left off with Rambam's explanation of different terms, and we are up to his Perek chapter. This is part 1, chapter 12, which in the Pines, and where he discusses the word kima, lakum, to get up, literally, and
page
that
30,
would be in the Pines on page
38.
What'd you say? 38, yeah.
38, yeah.
Yeah. And then in the and as in my usual manner, I might flip back and forth between the Hebrew Pines and the Hebrew kapach and the English Pines. And then in the second part of today, I'm going to continue where I began last week in chapter 46 of part 1. So but first, let's do chapter 12. I'll try to get through 3 terms today, chapter 12, 13, and 14, because they're all pretty short. And Rambam is right now laying out the meanings of these terms in order to teach us, his process of how to interpret the Torah in general. So he's not going to go through every single term in the Torah, but after he goes through about approximately, I think, 45 chapters or so of going through different terms, you get the idea of what he's trying to portray, what he's trying to tell us about how we're supposed to read the Torah, and ultimately how God is the anthropomorphic terms are being used to describe God. So here we go. Chapter 12 is the term kima, right? Lakum, right? To which shem mishutaf is an equivocal term. An equivocal term, according to the Rambam, means a term which has 2 meanings. So some words have one meaning, and then which ends up being used in different contexts to mean something else. The word lakum is an equivocal term. One of its meanings, and I'm reading from the English, is to get up, which is the opposite of sitting. He just discussed in the last chapter sitting down. If you're sitting down and you get up, that's lakum, that's to get up. Thus, we see in the verse, lo kam v'lo zam mimenu, he did not rise nor move for him, right? He didn't, in other words, he was sitting down and the person didn't get up for him. It also has a meaning when you're talking about the stability and validity of a matter. Something is stable, you say that it has kima, it has stability. And we find that in a few places from the verses of Yakim Hashem et devaro, right? God will fulfill his words. We say the word, or we have sometimes the term likayim. We say to fulfill a mitzvah, we always use the term likayim. I just added that example. Vayakam Sedei Ephron, where Abraham acquired the field of Ephron. It uses the term akum because it became established as his. V'kam habayis asher ba'ir. V'kam b'yadcha memlechet Yisrael. God promises that David, King David, through the prophet Shmuel, that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Uve'inyan zed nemar, and it's in this second language that whenever it uses the term kima in reference to God, that's why I flipped to the Hebrew. That's whenever it uses this term kima in reference to God, it's referring to this type of standing. So for example, when it says akum yomar Hashem, now I shall stand, says God. What it means is God says, what does it mean? I will stand. What God means is I will fulfill my promise. I will fulfill that which I said I was going to do. I will carry out my decree, my promise. I'm at the top of page 39 in the Pines, and my menace. Thus also, thou wilt arise and have compassion upon Zion, a famous verse. Atatakum terachem Zion, right? You, God, will arise and have compassion on Zion. What does that mean? Thou wilt carry out what thou hast promised as to having mercy upon her. You promised you are going to reestablish Zion. I will fulfill it. So whenever it uses the word kima, the Rambam is demonstrating that it doesn't mean that God stands up, right? But rather it means that he's going to establish as true the promises that he made. So because when someone decides to do something, he marks his impulse to do it. How does he mark his impulse to do it? Figuratively, by standing. You're sitting down and you're thinking, oh, what should I do? What should I do? And then you say, oh, I'm going to do this. So you get up and you do it. So that's how the term getting up came to mean that. And the word taken in this sense is used figuratively to denote the execution of God's decree against the people who have deserved punishment, entailing their destruction. So we see that I'll rise against the house of Jeroboam. And God says, I'm going to destroy the house of Yerovam, who is an evil king. But he will rise against the house of the evildoers. What does it mean? God will figuratively get up to punish them. His words, now will I rise, may likewise have this meaning. It could also mean that when God says, when it's said about God, you will arise and have compassion upon Zion, it means also not just that you will arise and fulfill your promise, but also you will arise against the enemies of Zion. And many biblical texts conform to this meaning, but he gave enough examples that we have enough. And for it is not to be found in them, but you shouldn't think, Rambam reminds us that there is a rising up and a sitting down of God may be exalted. It's interesting. He's emphasizing things so many times that he's emphasized so many times. And to us, it seems so simple because Rambam's thought has become so basic to our understanding of God and Judaism. But remember, in the Rambam's time, it wasn't so simple. Many people actually thought God got up and sat down because it said so. So he's trying to pound that into us. Accordingly, and he always, whenever he can, he brings proof from the Chazal, from the rabbis, where it says in the upper world, there is neither sitting nor standing. This is from the Talmud and Chagiga. God doesn't sit or stand. Sometimes the word standing also is the same, you stand up is the same thing as rising up. And then that leads to chapter 13, where he discusses the word of standing. It's similar, so I go through it pretty fast. That's amidah, is to stand. So la'amod is to stand, lakum is to get up, but you can see how they can often be used interchangeably. Sometimes it has the meaning to rise and stand. Thus, when he stood before Pharaoh, that's Moshe, though Moses and Samuel stood, right? And he stood by them. And sometimes it also means something else. The word has another meaning. It means to abstain and desist, right? La'amod, you're walking and then you stand, meaning you stop, right? So la'amod could sometimes mean to stop what you're doing. So therefore, it says, because they stood still and answered no more. Elsewhere, it has the meaning to be stable and durable. So standing could mean something that stands for a long time. Thus, that they may stand for many days, or that then thou shalt be able to stand. Or is, if I read from some of the Hebrew, some of you might recognize some of these verses. Leman yamdu yamim rabim. V'tzidkato omedet la'ad. God's righteousness stands forever. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that God stands. It means it's kayemet v'nisharet. It lasts forever and it's stable and durable. I'm turning the page on the English now, and unchanged. Again, his righteousness stands forever. That is permanent and enduring. Whenever this term standing occurs with reference to God, again, same thing. He's giving a rule. If it says the word God stands, this is what it means. It means that and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, that God shall stand upon the Mount of Olives in this day in the future. Does it mean that God's going to be standing there? Of course, it doesn't mean God's going to be standing on the Mount of Olives, right? What it means is that his intermediate causes, his effects, the things that God establishes, the things that he does on this world will be established, will be firm, will be solid, they will last. This shall be made clear when the equivocality of the term foot is mentioned. If we talk of a similar idea, when it uses the word feet, and Rambam is going to refer to that later, it doesn't mean that God actually has a foot. A foot is just the part of the body that we use to stand. So this meaning occurs in the words of God again. As for thee, stand thou here by me, right? God says, amod po, stand next to me. And in the verse, I stood between the Lord and you, so on. So again, the same idea is standing could mean to stop. More often it means, when it refers to God, it means that God stands forever. And then I'll do chapter 14, a little bit of a different subject, but the same thing, taking a term that has many meanings. The equivocality of the word Adam, right? Adam, which is the name of a person, a figure in history named Adam, who was Adam, the figure, one of the stars of the Genesis story, right? But it also is a derivative word for, it also means, it comes from another word, from the word Adama, which means earth, right? It also is, the word Adam designates the species of human beings, right? So thus, when it says, my spirit shall not abide in man, or who knoweth the spirit of the sons of man, so that man hath no preeminence over a beast. So these are all verses, familiar verses to us. And it's talking about mankind, it's talking about humanity. So it's also the name of the species. It is also, it has another meaning. It means Adam, meaning the multitude of people, the general public, as opposed to the others. And here it's interesting, because here Rambam is, again, and I try to point this out when I can, if he was writing a Perush on Genesis, a commentary on Genesis, this is how he would explain when it says the sons, the Bnei Elohim, which we often think we translate as those that are the angels saw the daughters of man, that they were good, and they took the daughters of man. Rambam is describing to us, no, man refers to the general public, meaning the common folk. So the contrast to the common folk are the leadership, the elite, the royalty, or the noblemen. So when it says that it says at the end of Parshat Bereshit that the people started becoming corrupt because the leadership saw daughters, women that belonged to the common folk, and would take them against their will. So the world was becoming corrupt. And this is part of the lead up to the Noach story, and so on. So Adam means humanity. It means, it's a person's name. It also is a derivative word that comes from the word that means earth. And it also refers to common folk, to be distinguished from the nobility, or the leaders, or whatever you want to call the not so common folk. So that I'm going to stop there for the words before I go to chapter 46, which where I'll be continuing from last week. I don't know if there's any comments on these three terms. We had Kima, that's rising up, Amida, standing, and Adam, human. Go ahead.
I have a question about Adam. Maybe this isn't a question that Maimonides ever thought about or would have considered important, but does it include women as well?
It sounds like it. It's Adam, meaning all of humanity. By the way, this is interesting, because what you just said reminded me a little, because about a week or two ago in the Daf Yomi, we referenced a Gemara that said that Adam only refers to Jews. Rambam just contradicted that. Rambam just contradicted that Gemara and said that Adam refers to all of humanity. And it wasn't deliberate. It's deliberate that Rambam did that, and we'll find in other places where it's clear that Rambam interpreted the word Adam in Tanakh as referring to all of humanity. And yeah, that would include women too. Any other comments on the words? So Kima, Amida, and Adam. We now know the Rambam's explanation of those words. So then after he goes through all the words, he starts describing in chapter 46 why the Torah taught us about God by using all of these terms that are very anthropomorphic terms, are very human. And he started by explaining that in the beginning of chapter 46, which we did last week, chapter 46 is on page number 90, it would be 95, 697 in the Pines. And basically, he started explaining that if you wanted to describe someone, the existence of a certain entity, you can do it in two ways. You can describe the entity itself, like the essence of the thing itself, or you can describe the circumstances that exist that demonstrate that the entity exists. And his example, Rambam's example was, if there's a king of a certain a place, and you want to convince someone, tell someone about the king. So you can tell them about the king himself, what he looks like, who he's like, what his name is, so on. Or you can demonstrate by looking at the nation around and looking at all the trappings that there must be a king there, because when you look around, you see there's a system of justice. So there must be someone who's in charge. There's a palace, and there must be some guy who lives there. There's an army. There must be someone who commands it, so on and so forth. So and Rambam gave us a little hint, but which we ended with last week, that God is an essence that we cannot understand, right? And if the Torah remembers coming to a people at a time when these concepts were completely new. They were steeped in paganism, and they had no idea what these concepts were about. So the Torah has to teach them somehow. And how's the Torah going to teach them? So it can't teach them about the essence of God. It would have made no sense to them, right? So therefore, the Torah had to teach us about God in a different way. And today he's going to start describing to us how the Torah started teaching the common folk, the people, which was all of us at the time of the reception of the Torah, how the Torah decided to do that. So I'm at the top of page 98. I might have started, it's the paragraph that starts with now. I may have started this a little last week, but I'm going to start from here and we'll move on. And I'll kind of read the English, but I might paraphrase here and there on my own in a little bit more modern language. So now in all that we have said by way of parable, there's nothing to give an indication. That was the parable of looking at all the things in the kingdom that indicate that there must be a king in charge. There's nothing to give an indication of the ruler's essence and of the true reality of his substance in respect of his being a ruler. A similar thing has occurred with regard to the knowledge of God, may he be honored and magnified, given to the multitude in all the books of the prophets and also in the Torah. For necessity, so nowhere in the Torah do we have a very clear description of what the essence of God is. For necessity required that all of them be given guidance to the belief in the existence of God, may be exalted, and in his possessing all the perfections. The Torah has, and the prophets that trying to teach us about God need to guide us to the belief that God exists, that he's real, that he's a real entity. And not only is he real, but that he possesses all of these, what the Rambam calls perfections, all of these characteristics which we need to know about him, but that God is real, and the things that he does is real, and that he's the one that makes them happen. So I mean to say guidance to the belief that he does not merely exist, as the earth and heavens do, and a lot of things exist, right? But that he is an existence who is living, possessed of knowledge and of power. And Rambam later is going to tell us that we don't even understand what that means when God has knowledge, or that God is living, or that God exists. But he for right now, you have to play along with the Rambam's trying to get us to that point, and having all the other characteristics that ought to be believed with reference to his existence. He's hinting to us that soon he's going to tell us that even when we say that he's living, it doesn't really mean that he's living, which we says this shall be made clear later on. I'll leave that later on. But Rambam himself is trying to get us through the process that the Torah tries to get us through. The minds of the multitude were accordingly guided to the belief that he exists by imagining that he is corporeal. So the minds of the people, we're talking at the time of the reception of the Torah, and not just that moment, but the thousands of years after that, where we study the Torah and learn these concepts, we try to imagine him as if he has a body, right? And to the belief that he is living by imagining that he's capable of motion. This is the key characteristic of life in this stage in philosophy is the idea of motion. Something that it's alive demonstrates it's the fact that it's alive by moving. So by describing God as having motion, we can get a grasp of God as being alive, so to speak. For the multitude, because people perceive nothing other than bodies as having a firmly established existence. The only thing that we can see exist is a body. Like a guy sitting next to you in the room, he exists because he's sitting there, right? The rock exists because it's sitting there. And as being indubitably true, no one's going to argue with you if there's a guy sitting next to you, whether there's a guy sitting next to you, right? For anything that is not a body, but if it's not a thing, but it subsists in a body, is existent, right? The couch that's next to me is a thing because it's there, it has a body, right? But its existence is more deficient than that of a body, as it requires a body in order to exist. However, uh, the physical objects that we're aware of require a thing in order to be existent, right? There's no such thing as this table that my computer is on that I'm sitting in front of, unless there's an actual table, right? So in order to say that there is a God, we try to imagine him as if he has a body, because people find it very difficult to imagine something that exists if it doesn't have some sort of a body. That, however, which is neither a body nor in a body, is not an existent thing in any respect, according to man's initial representation. According to people, a simple-minded person can't conceive of something that exists that doesn't have it isn't a thing. It has to have some sort of a body, right? It has to either be a rock, a table, a human, a lion, a giraffe, whatever. It has to be a something. So therefore, God is described with the body, particularly from the point of view of the imagination, right? It's very difficult to take a simple, normal person, including ourselves. We're also simple and normal, I think, right? It's very hard to imagine something without having a thing to imagine. Similarly, the multitude do not represent, and the same way, if we try to say that God has life. Now, remember, I'm reminding you that Rambam will tell us later that God really doesn't have life the same way we think of it. But for now, let's just imagine God is living, right? As anything other than motion. How do we think of something alive? How do we differentiate between something that's alive and not alive? Something that's alive moves. Something that's not alive doesn't move. Now, modern science might contradict that. We might know of living creatures that don't actually move, but that's not the point here. It's just to think about it philosophically from Rambam's perspective. But people in this time and consider that which has no local motion due to its will is not alive. If it doesn't move, it's not alive. Despite the fact that motion does not pertain to the substance of the living, it's just an accident attaching to it. And Rambam uses the term accident to refer to a characteristic. Movement isn't life. Movement is just an indication of life. It's something it's a characteristic that living things have. Similarly, apprehension is the same thing. Understanding something, when we understand something, as it is habitually known among us, how do we understand something? How do we define something? It's through the instrumentality of the senses, through hearing and seeing, right? So the way we know things around us, we perceive them by hearing things and by seeing things. And similarly, we do not know, nor can we represent to ourselves how a notion can be transmitted. If I'm going to explain something to you, how do I do that? From the soul of one individual, from one person who's among us, like let's say me in this case, to the soul of another, and I'm speaking to you, except the instrumentality of speech. I speak. So if I'm going to communicate an idea to you, how do I do that? I do it through speech, which is a sound produced by the lips, the tongue, and the other organs of speech, and so on. Accordingly, as our minds are likewise guided to the belief that God apprehends, so when we say, if we imagine that God can conceive of things, right, and that notions are communicated from him to the prophets, and that God communicates ideas to us through like such as communicating to prophets. So therefore, he is described on the top of page 99 as hearing and seeing. That's why, in order to explain to people that this God who exists is also a being who perceives things, we say that he hears and he sees, because that's the only way we can conceive of apprehending things is that. So therefore, he's also described to us as speaking. What does that mean? Does God speak? Of course not. He doesn't have lips. He doesn't have a tongue. He doesn't have teeth. He doesn't have a throat and lungs, right? But he say that because the meaning thereof being the notions are communicated from him, may it be exalted to the prophets. God communicates ideas to us, and we call that speaking. This is what it means, prophecy. And later on, this shall be made clear. Rambam is referencing to, he's going to have many chapters on the notion of prophecy and how it works and what it means. And we're definitely going to have to get there because that's a very important part of Rambam's thought. But the idea being that when God communicates, however God communicates that idea to any other entity, in this case, human beings, we call it speaking, even though he's not actually speaking. So later on, again, as we have no intellectual cognition of our bringing somebody other than us to existence except through a direct act. When we say that somebody creates something, how do we create something? If I decide I want to make a table, I have to do something, right? I have to cut the wood. I have to saw it into the right shapes and sizes and nail the pieces together or whatever. I have to, right? If I bring it into existence, I have to do something. So when we say that God is active, we describe it as if he's doing things. Is God actually doing things? No, but how else can we got something? But we call it doing things because in our perception, that's the only way to make things happen. Similarly, in view of the fact that the multitude, when we think of something that's alive, how do we differentiate between something that's alive and something that's not alive? We apprehend no living thing that is not endowed with a soul. It has to have some sort of a soul, some sort of a life force. In Maimonidean science, the life force was the what Galen would have described as the life force that was in the beating heart and was being emanated out to the rest of the body. This was, to them, this was the soul was a scientific entity. So Rambam saying a soul here, you and I think of souls more often as spiritual entities. Of course, Rambam also believed and understood that it was a spiritual entity, but Rambam thought of a soul also as a scientific entity, right? And though the term soul is an equivocal one, as has been made clear, which we'll get to. Rambam, the word neshama, soul, is one of the chapters which, as we continue going through terms, we'll get to the word neshama, right? And they'll explain what it means, and we'll get a little bit better idea then what a soul means. But the meaning, when we say that God has a soul, we mean that he is a living. It's just simply a way of us describing him being alive. Since with regard to us, the apprehension can be made that all of these acts are only performed by means of bodily organs, but all of those things that I just described, Rambam saying, the motion, the seeing, the hearing, the speaking, the so on and so on, all of those things, in our minds, we associate them with bodily organs. We speak with the mouth, we hear with our ears, see with our eyes, etc., etc., etc. So therefore, we describe God as if he has these organs. All these organs are figuratively ascribed to him. Those by means of which locomotion takes place. We talk about the feet. Those mean hearing and seeing and smelling come about. We talk about the ear, the eyes, the nose, and those by which speech, matter of speech. We talk about the mouth, the tongue, the voice. Finally, those by means which he acts, we talk about is the hands, the fingers, the palm, the arm. To sum all this, Rambam says in the middle of page 99, God, may he be exalted above every deficiency, has had bodily organs figuratively described him in order that his acts should be indicated by this means, right? And the reason why the Torah uses all of these things is so that we as human beings can understand that God does all this stuff. He apprehends, he acts, he does, he creates, right? So we pretend that he has these body parts in order that we can conceive of it. And those the acts are figuratively ascribed to him. And even the acts themselves, we figuratively prescribe. In other words, when we say that God sees and hears, it obviously doesn't mean the same thing as it means when we say we see and hear, right? But we ascribe it to him because we want to make sure we understand that he has a certain perfection. God apprehends because God is God, right? But it's not identical to the particular act mentioned. It's not identical to the type of seeing and hearing that we perceive. For instance, an eye, an ear, a hand, a mouth, a tongue have been figuratively ascribed to him, so that by this means, sight, hearing, action, speech should be indicated. But sight and hearing have been figuratively, but the sight and hearing itself is figuratively ascribed to him with a view to indicating apprehension in general, that God apprehends. And later in the book, Rambam is going to say apprehension itself is figuratively ascribed to God. But it keeps on going, but we'll get there. For this reason, you will find. And here, Rambam says something interesting. We know that the Torah says, right, in several places, it says the Hebrew language substitutes the apprehension made by one sense for that which made by the other. Thus, Scripture says, see the word of the Lord. What does it mean, see the word of the Lord? It said, why didn't it say hear the word of the Lord, right? Or it says Re'u reach beni. Yitzchak says, see the scent of my son, right? Which is like saying, smell the smell of my son, right? The intended meaning refers to the apprehension. The point the verses are trying to tell us is that apprehend it, because whether you're apprehending it get the point, right? Seeing, smelling, hearing, these are all ways of apprehending things. And that's why it says at Sinai itself, it says at that height of history, all of the people saw the sounds. What does that mean that they saw the sounds, right? It's, that Roa and Sanira, they could hear what Rambam is saying the Torah is teaching us exactly this lesson, the point that he's trying to make, that at the time, the Torah did not want to say they heard the sounds because that would anthropomorphize, so to speak, the experience. The experience of Sinai was God communicating with the people. The communication was not through sound, not through sight, not through speech, not through smell, not through anything. It deliberately describes it in a way that's confusing in order to teach us this very point. It was an apprehension. The station constituted, according to Rambam, a vision of prophecy, as is well known and universally in our community, right? We know that what we heard, so to speak, at Sinai was a prophecy that the entire people were privy to and heard. But again, no one actually heard or saw anything. It was a perception that we all perceived. Action and speech are ascribed to God so that an overflow proceeding from him should thereby be indicated, as shall be made clear further on. Again, we'll get back to this later. All bodily organs that you find mentioned in all the books of the prophecy are either organs of local motion mentioned with a view to indicating life. Rambam is emphasizing this again, or organs of sensation mentioned with a view to indication and apprehension. I'm gonna go through this a little quick. Or organs of prehension mentioned with a view of to indicating action of God, organs of speech, so on. And I'm skipping a little. The guidance contained in all of these figurative senses is intended to establish in us the belief that there is an existent who is living, is the agent who produces everything other than he, and in addition apprehends his own act. When we shall begin to expand the negation of the attributes, that's a concept which we will get into, because Rambam is then going to say, well, what is truly the essence of God? And he's going to basically tell us that we can't describe it. It's impossible. The best way to describe it is through what he calls negative attributes, which is a very classic Maimonidean idea, which we'll have to get to. But when we get there, Rambam says, when we begin to get there, then we shall make clear how all this is reducible to one notion. Because Rambam himself just divided God into different things, into his apprehension, into his living, his doing, but those are more than one notion. And Rambam is going to have to melt those down into one. God has to be singular. So which is exclusively that of the essence of God may be exalted. So we'll get there. But for the purpose of the present chapter is to make clear of the meaning of the bodily organs ascribed to God may be exalted above every deficiency, to explain that all of them are mentioned with a view to indicating the actions proper to these organs and so on. And then the Rambam ends that paragraph. The Torah speaks in the language of the sons of man. Like, right, the Torah is Medaber V'Lashon B'nei Adam. The Torah speaks. This is a classic Rambam using this phrase that the Torah speaks B'Lashon B'nei Adam, in the language of man. Even though when the Chazal, when the rabbis use that phrase, they're not talking about this Maimonidean philosophy. They're talking about something else completely. But Rambam appropriates the phrase to mean that Torah speaks in a language that we can understand, even though it doesn't really mean what it says. So I want to, just so I can get just past a couple more small chapters, I'm going to kind of run through them quickly. The next, not paragraphs, I mean, the organs of local motion described to him at the bottom of page 100 are, for instance, he brings verses. I just look at the next four small paragraphs. He brings verses to demonstrate the points that he's making about the voice, the speech, the voices of God, the organs of sensation, of action, motion, etc. You can look at those verses yourself. So where I'm going to stop for this week at the word nostril, which is in the middle, in the second paragraph at the end of 101 in the Pines, for you have kindled a fire in my nostril, which is an example of using a nostril to just talk about God's organs of sensation, so to speak. So I'll stop here and we'll pick up from here next week. But these are very classic, basic ideas that have become the standard in our religion. I mean, these are the standard. I mean, this is one of the places where Maimonides had a solid victory in describing to us the nature of God and the nature of how to interpret these types of verses. So if anyone has any comments or questions, now is a good time. Go ahead.
I'll just say what Rashi says about when all the people saw the sounds. He literally says that it was visual sound, which is, of course, a complete paradox.
It's a paradox, and Rashi is bringing about a paradox But Rambam would have, if Rambam was writing that commentary, he would have written something else, right? He would have written exactly what he just said here.
Right.
That there wasn't sounds, and there wasn't and there wasn't sights. There was apprehension. There was communication of ideas between God and humanity on a level which we can't describe. So it's just picking words.
Right.
But yeah, and a lot of people speculate about Rashi and where he stood on the idea of anthropomorphism. I'm not going to take a position on that now because I'm not lecturing about Rashi, but there certainly are indicators that sound like Rashi takes the position of anthropomorphism, and there's other places not. That's the scholarly debate, which I'm not going to get into. But,
Rashi was before Rambam.
Yes, slightly, but he's, as far as yes, Rashi was slightly before Rambam. I'm almost positive. I know for sure that he never quotes Rambam. There's no indication that. I'm pretty sure he was. I have to look that. So
Rambam had been aware of Rashi, and
I'm not aware of Rambam ever mentioning Rashi either.
Interesting.
I have to look that up, to be honest. I should know that, but I'm not aware of any actual quotes from one or the other. There certainly were Rishonim, scholars in the same milieu as Rashi in those parts of France and Germany that did espouse ideas that were anthropomorphic. But Rashi himself is mixed.
I just looked it up. Rambam was almost exactly 100 years after Rashi.
Okay. So it's
Rashi was in France and Rambam was in Spain, and
not so far though. I mean, I don't know how quickly Rashi's commentary became sort of as embedded and as standard as it is, but
it wasn't until Art Scroll, I don't think.
no. Oh well, okay.
It was a little before that.
Yeah, it was before that. In Eastern Europe already, for a couple hundred years, Rashi was pretty well standardized. But I'm pretty sure, but if someone showed me otherwise, I'd be very interested. I'm not aware that Rambam ever quotes Rashi anywhere. Or if there's any indication that he acknowledged Rashi's existence, even. I might be wrong about that. I'm not I'll if someone could, I'll probably Google around and we'll all probably do the same thing, but I'm pretty sure that Rambam never quotes Rashi. There's just a couple articles, maybe I can find some that discuss anthropomorphism among the Bali Tosfot, who were the students of Rashi. And Rambam definitely has them in mind. I don't think them, not necessarily specifically a particular scholar, but he has that whole school of thought in mind. And he definitely knew that they existed, that people that actually believed that God had a form of a body, etc. And he was definitely attacking them. Any other comments, questions? If there aren't, then we can call it. What? Sorry, go ahead.
I know I just said this is great. This is very interesting stuff, very important stuff.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I'm glad everyone enjoyed it. And I hope to see you next week. I'm going to do the same thing. We'll continue with some terms, and then we'll continue from here. And I might decide to pluck from some other places just to keep spicing things up, because I'm going to be jumping around the book as we go through it. But have a wonderful evening.
Okay. Thank you.